There we are. Okay. Ready?
I think so.
All right. I know it's going to be that kind of day. Hey, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I am your host, Olga Peters, and this week we are talking with regular contributor Emilie Kornheiser. Hey, Emilie.
Hi, Olga. Nice to see you.
It's good to see you too. And we just have to give a little word of warning to our listeners today. Emilie's having some work done at her house or something, and it makes lots of noise.
It's very noisy. So it might add some excitement. Hoping that at the end of it, the scaffolding that's been on the back of my house for the last 4 years will be done. So who knows? We'll see.
You'll have a whole new view, a whole new way to see the world. We also, in my neighborhood, they are doing some work across the street as well. So you have been warned, there may be crash, bang, boom in the background. We are going to talk about hazard pay and the COVID-19 pandemic in a moment. But before we do, Emilie, I just want to revisit something from last week's conversation with Stephanie Yu from the Public Assets Institute. You know, at the end of the conversation, I had brought up the state's or the Joint Fiscal Office's basic need budget and how it feels like such a disconnect for me that quite often what the state says is a basic needs budget and kind of a basic hourly wage people need to meet their, housing, health insurance, clothing, and food needs. And put some money in savings. How it feels like such a disconnect that the state says one number and what a lot of people earn is not the same thing. And to me, that's a symbol that the system isn't working. And Stephanie brought up the kind of the thought of, well, there's the system and then there's people's personal choices. And I just wanted to dig into that a little bit because yes, she's right. There's the system and then there's the economic system and then there's people's personal choices. You can choose to take a job that doesn't pay as much for some reasons than jobs that do pay more. For example, as someone who works in media and communications, if I was a PR person, I would make more money than I do as a journalist. But what I think we need to keep in mind is when I remember when I first came across the JFO's budget, basic needs budget, it's probably like 2016. And I just did a very unscientific search of jobs that were available in our area. And most of the ones that I came across on all the job searching ads did not pay what the JFO said we should make. And so but if I looked at jobs in like Massachusetts and New Hampshire, yes, there started to be better paying jobs. And I just think we should keep that in mind when we talk about wages, that yes, there are personal decisions that people make, but there are definitely things around wages in Vermont that are not working.
Absolutely. And my memory of when Stephanie was talking about personal choices was actually, she was talking about the choices that people make with their spending when they are making over and above living wages. So the context about people's capacity to be taxed. And it was about, and people's sense of enough and what sort of happens when people are making above and beyond a living wage budget and paying sort of their basic needs bills, the people's sort of lived experience of their taxable capacity after that. And that's sort of where she was saying some of the personal choices happen.
That is so interesting because that's not what I heard. What I heard was so often when I bring this issue up, it reminds me, I think in Vermont, how we've gotten used to keeping a low bar. Because when I bring this issue up, so many people are like, nobody's going to make that much money. Like, so why do you even bother asking the question? And if someone's not making enough money, it's probably just, they chose to buy an iPhone instead. those kind
Yeah.
of like and not that I think Stephanie thinks that way, but
Mm-hmm.
that's what I heard. And I just find that so fascinating how when we talk about economics, that while yes, there is that personal component with the decisions we make, we so often, I don't know, I just think in Vermont, when it comes around jobs and wages, we have just gotten used to a really low bar.
And I think some of that is structural. So I think the bulk of that is structural. But we make choices about the structures that we live in. So Vermont really prioritizes our small business environment and the values that we think small businesses hold. And we have sort of stories about that being more family centric or more flexible, or the money being sort of closer to the communities that it's where profits come from, or the profits being returned to communities more likely, or a bunch of things like that, or some sort of magical spirit of entrepreneurship that we talked about with Matt Dunn. But there's also trade-offs there around the cost of health insurance, the ability to provide real family medical leave or vacation time, that are much harder in a small business environment because they're a more costly thing to do on a small scale. And so that becomes, so I think that's a choice that we're making as communities, not a choice that we're making individually. And I think there are mechanisms to remedy that would lead to higher wages. So, which we've talked about, so one choice that we could make, given the choice that we've already made as a community, we've chosen to really value small businesses. And what we could do as a next step from that choice would be to then acknowledge the challenges that small businesses have and create systems to lower their costs and have more of that money go towards wages, like universal healthcare or a universal family medical leave system, to, given us, when you're at a very small scale, the value of having something be part of the collective good is much higher. So those are just sort of some ideas that I have about choices that we could make as a community to compensate for the other choices that we make as a community, so that people's individual choices can be wider because they have more dollars in their pockets.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But no, I don't think that like anyone deserves to be poor because they want to be a journalist rather than a PR person.
Right. Well, this brings us into the hazard pay.
Wait, can I add one more thing about choices, which I think is very Windham
do.
County? So we do have people in Windham County who I think take up a lot of our collective imagination, but maybe are not that much the majority of people that have.
Are we talking about stories versus like facts here?
I think we are.
Oh, cool.
So, and there's some real people like this, people who have chosen to live in Vermont, making much less money than they would somewhere else. They came here with a certain degree of financial privilege. And so they are choosing to be sort of homesteading, dropping out of the rat race, homeschooling, whatever it is. And we have multiple generations of folks who have done this.
Right.
And that is sort of poverty by choice, but it's poverty with a lot of financial cushion all around it. And so that's being low income, but that's not being poor, I think. And I think that conversation gets like really mixed up in Windham County when we talk about other challenges for people's lives.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because I'm so sorry, I cannot remember the person who said this to me, so I can't give her proper credit, but I think she was right. When we talk about income and we talk about things like poverty or being low income, what they can really mean is, what access do we have to resources? So like, you can be low income and struggle in that vein, but still have a lot of like social capital and a really strong family and friend network, which can offset, income in a different way. Or you could be like the example you just gave, that someone has chosen a certain job or a certain income, but they have a lot of backup resources, financial resources. But then there are some people who, they don't have much income, they don't have a strong social network, they don't have other resources to access at all. And I think we forget that when we talk about income, what we really should be saying is resources.
Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of folks in our community that have very strong social networks, but those social networks don't necessarily have a lot of financial resources. And so they're very available to help, but the dollars connected to that aren't there. And so that's another sort of access to capital issue.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So this brings us to the interesting conversation of hazard pay, I think. And Emilie in a minute can give us a little more detail on the two bills that are running through the legislature right now around hazard pay. But what's interesting for me right now are two things around this discussion of hazard pay and equity. First is, because we haven't all been impacted by COVID in the same way, how does the legislature on a broad scale kind of ensure some kind of equity in the hazard pay? But also what I'm just curious about is, so many Vermonters work more than one job. And so how do we consider the people who maybe on paper look like they have a full-time job with a full-time income, and they didn't lose that during COVID, but maybe they had 2 or 3 side jobs that just floated them, but they lost those. It's like, I'm really curious about that, Emilie. I hope we can dive into that a little bit.
And I've been thinking about, it's a big question.
I know.
I'm not sure I have very much for that. So we're going to get like really deep into unemployment insurance law there. But what I think, I've heard a few people use this metaphor of, COVID is the storm and we're all having the same storm, but we're all experiencing it from like very different boats, right? Mm-hmm. So some of us are drowning and some of us are getting seasick and, some of us are just enjoying the view. And there's that awesome banging. Don't know how loud it is for you. Makes it harder for me to think. So when I think about people's resilience with regards to weathering some of the impacts of the pandemic, we have all of these folks who have continued to return to work every day. Some because they believe deeply in what they do, and many more because they have no choice. This is their income. Right. And they didn't feel perhaps enough trust in government, or perhaps their unemployment insurance wouldn't have been high enough to step out of work for their own personal safety and know that their needs were still going to be met. So we have a lot of people who didn't necessarily consent to putting their lives on the line and being an essential worker, but did it because they felt they had no choice. And when I think about those folks and what it means to support them as they weather the pandemic, some of that is making sure that their workers' rights are protected, knowing that they'll have workers' comp if they get sick, knowing that proper PPE is supplied, and that we are really being clear with employers about the need to protect employees in that way. But also, when we think about the money that's being spent to help weather this economic catastrophe, a lot of it is going to business owners, and much less of it is going to the people on the ground, who, in study after study after study, we see that if money goes directly into the hands of folks who make even less than $100,000 a year, that sort of immediately gets spent and recirculated in the economy. Whereas when money goes to a business, it might sit there for whatever reason and not be recirculated or go out of state more easily. And so these two bills are pieces of our response to the pandemic that really get money directly in the hands of Vermonters. So one of them is an expansion of hazard pay to more workers and sort of new categories of workers.
Right. And
the second one is an economic stimulus equity package that takes the $1,200, the idea of the $1,200 that many of us got from the federal government, the federal stimulus payment, one of, in my household, one was a direct deposit, and then the other one was a credit card with like a huge American flag on it. And, you know, everyone's letters were signed by the president. Yeah, it was.
I didn't get a letter from the president.
You didn't?
No, I got a check though, which is more what I cared about.
Yeah, that's really funny. Okay, so everyone, you know, we all got it. We all got our payments in different ways. Not clear how, which makes me nervous. But anyway, so many of us got these payments. And then a lot of Vermonters who don't have social security numbers, or who are married to people or partnered with people who don't have social security numbers, did not get this payment, even though they've been paying taxes.
Right.
And many of them have been working. So, so a lot of that, I mean, working through the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And so that is undocumented farm workers, that is green card holders, that is a whole like big range of folks who live in Vermont and really could have benefited from this economic stimulus check in order to weather the storm of COVID. Because what we've talked about before, and I think we talked about this with Stephanie and maybe with one other listener, maybe with Matt Dunn, talked about how the impacts of the economic impacts of the pandemic are being really postponed through a number of things. And one of them was that $1,200, right? So there was the $1,200, there was the fact that it happened at the same time that tax returns usually happen. And so lower income people had that boost. There was the extra money coming in through unemployment insurance. There was the fact that it was sort of spring and summer, which is a less expensive time for Vermonters. You're not putting on snow tires, you're not buying oil. And so all of those things really helped us postpone what I believe is sort of inevitably going to be a significant struggle in our communities. And so this economic stimulus equity payment that's going to undocumented workers and other legal permanent citizens and residents is a way of sort of helping to weather that storm and postponing the impacts of the storm. And so those are the two bills. The economic stimulus equity just passed the House and got passed over the Senate, and the hazard pay bill that expands hazard pay to more workers got voted out of the Senate and is now in the House.
And I just want to remind listeners that the hazard pay bill, there was a form of hazard pay that was passed earlier this year, in case anyone's sitting there going, wait a minute, didn't we do this already? But it covered only a few categories of workers, mostly healthcare frontline workers. And this second one is covering more job types.
And a lot of that is because when we received this $1 billion from the federal government through the CARES Act, the rules on how it could be spent were not fully spelled out to the states. And so it's been a real process of back and forth and negotiating between our legislative council and between the feds, between our legislative delegation, acting on our behalf, seeing what other states are getting away with and then doing it. Because if you spend it wrong, sort of against the regulations, then it gets clawed back, which is a really terrible process and very expensive.
We don't want that.
We have gotten new guidance since the last hazard pay bill passed. That one had to have, there's this word nexus that's used in legislation all the time, but it just means like touching something.
Okay.
So the first hazard pay bill, basically all of the categories of folks who are eligible for it had to have a very increased chance of touching someone who was COVID positive, basically.
Oh, okay.
And so that's why it was healthcare workers. It's like people who work in hospitals or nursing homes with people who have likely, who are likely to actually touch someone who is sick. Okay. When we think about early care and education workers or grocery store workers, which were sort of the two biggest categories that I heard from people, like, are you kidding me? They were in incredibly hazardous positions.
Yeah.
Yes, they were in incredibly hazardous positions because they were in repeated, regular, intimate contact with a large swath of people, but there was no those people weren't more likely to be sick than anyone else in the population. And so that's why originally we thought that they didn't have a close enough nexus to COVID. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. It
Okay.
does.
And so now we've expanded, the Senate expanded, and this passed on Tuesday through the Senate, expanded it to grocery store workers, pharmacy workers, a retail establishment, provided that that retail establishment was open to the general public during that like first 2 months of the pandemic, before we really like had a clear sense of what safety looked like.
Right.
A wholesale distributor making deliveries to those retailers, because we've seen, you know, I don't know about you, but that was one thing that I really noticed in those early months, was like all of the people that were still going in and out of all of these places. Trash collection or waste management service, childcare facilities, Voc rehab service provider. So that's sort of like, you know, nursing home, near a nursing home, funeral establishments or crematoriums. Yeah. And then the last one is that anyone that provides security services to any of the other covered employers.
Okay, interesting.
Because those are usually contracted services, but they would still be sort of on those sites that we are now seeing as increased risk locations.
And remind us, this hazard pay, it's almost like that expanded unemployment benefit. So it's an extra paycheck on top of what you might be getting from your employer. Exactly.
And it's just for sort of the 2 months right at the beginning of the pandemic when everything was shut down and then we still had some people that were going to work. It's to really honor those people and the extra time that they had to spend with their protective equipment and the extra risk that they took to themselves in order to keep us all fed and healthy and safe, and also so that they could pay their own bills.
Yes.
Yeah. And so there's still debate about whether or not there's going to be an income cap. The previous hazard pay bill capped income, I think, and I don't have this in front of me, so I'm sorry. I think it was $25 an hour, but it might have been 20. And there's some debate in the House about whether or not we're going to change that cap or not.
Interesting. We have to go to break, but before we do, I'm just curious, what's some of the thought behind capping that, having a cap or not having a cap on the income?
So part of it is what I was saying about some people didn't have the economic freedom to not be working. And that's a way of sort of differentiating those folks. Some of it is that, you know, being a doctor fits in here if we don't have an income cap. And so is that necessarily the best use of federal funds to add a very small increase to a very, you know, it becomes an exponentially less impactful payment as you go up the salary scale, right?
Yeah.
So it's sort of the opposite of a progressive thing.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense? So like
it
won't be a meaningful amount of money to a doctor, even though it'd be a very meaningful amount of money to a licensed nurse assistant. And so why don't we spend the money where it can be meaningful?
Right. Fantastic. Thank you for that explanation. We're going to head to break, but the Montpelier Happy Hour will return on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, in a moment. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. As always, we are talking about how things in Montpelier shake out for Windham County, and the views and opinions, Emilie, are ours and nobody else's, especially not the radio stations. Remember that. Don't forget
Always.
that. Always. If you're just joining us, a couple of heads up, both Emilie and I outside our homes are having some work done. So you may hear crash, bang, boom. You have been warned. The other thing is we are talking about hazard pay and the Vermont Coronavirus Economic Stimulus Equity Program. So yes, H968 for any of those nerdy folks out there who like to Google these types of things.
And the hazard pay bill we were talking about before the break is S353.
S353.
Mhm.
Okay. So Emilie, I know that this economic stimulus equity program is supposed to help folks who were bypassed by the federal stimulus, the $1,200 stimulus check. But I'm curious because some of these folks are undocumented workers, some of them might be green card holders. But I'm really curious, if someone is an undocumented worker, how can they even be identified for this program to
Yeah.
get the money in the first place?
So probably about a little more than half of the people that we are expecting to be covered by this are undocumented workers. And so for the most part, those are folks who are paying, and I am going to add another caveat to our previous caveat. I am very far from an expert on immigration law and employment law related to immigration law. This is all fairly new information for me. I have a cheat sheet that I was really interested to learn about and learn more about. And then I have my own experiences working in actually other cities in restaurants with undocumented folks. And so hearing about their lives from them. And so that is my expertise with this, is sort of collaborating with Migrant Justice, which is a Vermont organization, and then personal experiences outside of Vermont. So we might
No
get,
legal advice.
I have no
here.
idea fairly quickly, but most undocumented workers in Vermont pay taxes on their wages because their employer pays those for them. There's a wide variety of ways that people sort of wind up in that employed undocumented situation that we're not going to get into here, but to say that their employers are still paying taxes on their behalf and they are not then collecting those tax returns, even though they often qualify. When we think about the shape of the Vermont economy in relationship to undocumented workers, about half of the undocumented workers in Vermont work in the dairy sector.
Mm-hmm.
And those are folks, and then a lot more sort of in the agricultural sector, but not the dairy sector. I just want to be clear, I do understand that dairy is part of agriculture. I'm just getting, the dairy is the largest segment of the agriculture sector, because now we're getting into both farming and migrant labor, two things that are
very complicated.
Yes. So most of those folks continued going to work every day during this time. And they were working in close quarters, often living in close quarters with each other. And you can't just like not go milk a cow one day, right?
Yeah, the cow will
the
be
cow
very unhappy.
Wants to be milked, whether there's a pandemic going on or not.
Yep.
So we have a lot of people who are sort of at increased risk, really holding together our farms and the basis of Vermont's economy during this time. These are folks who have lived in Vermont for a while. They have kids in schools, members of their community. So it's about 1,000 children that we're talking about that are children of these folks. There's a whole category of people that if you were married to someone who, or partnered with someone who didn't have a social security number, you are not eligible and your child is not eligible. So that's sort of so that's an interesting piece of it.
So wait, just to clarify, what if you have a social security number, you're married to someone who doesn't? Does that disqualify both of you, or?
It disqualifies your child.
Okay, interesting.
So we're talking about 1,000 children, Vermont children. Okay. And then there's a whole collection of folks who have, who are here with green cards or sort of other visas and don't have social security numbers. I've talked to a few constituents in Brattleboro who are just sort of like midway through the process and didn't have a social security number yet at the time that this happened, who also did not receive those payments. And these are often folks who are, you know, raising families here, have been living here for 20 years. Becoming a citizen is an incredibly strenuous, expensive, and difficult process.
And not a fast process either.
No, incredibly slow, incredibly slow. And so people might have applied years and years ago and still be working their way through the paperwork.
Yep.
And so those are sort of the categories of folks that we're talking about. So there is something called an ITIN. It's an individual taxpayer identification number.
Mm-hmm.
And it's issued by the IRS to individuals who are required to have a U.S. taxpayer identification number to pay taxes, but who do not have and are not eligible for a Social Security number.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't serve any purpose other than federal tax reporting. And so
Right.
those folks weren't eligible. And so it's easier to find those folks, right? They're like part of our system. The other way that we're likely to be getting people connected to this is through advocacy organizations like Migrant Justice. And people might know Migrant Justice from their Milk with Dignity campaign that's been going on for a while. They've been sort of working with Hannaford's and Ben & Jerry's and Cabot to try to improve the conditions for folks working on dairy farms. And so really helping people just know it's there and come apply for it. One challenge that everyone's sort of foreseeing and nervous about this process is it's a really scary time to be an undocumented. Yeah, it's a really scary time to even be a documented immigrant in America. And Vermont is not immune from the significant white supremacy action that's been happening elsewhere in the country. We have ICE agents that operate throughout the state of Vermont. We have cohorts of white supremacist, like emergent militias. We have folks that are coming to Black Lives Matter rallies with, automatic weapons. This is happening here the same way it's happening everywhere else in the country. And people are scared here the same way they are everywhere else in the country. And it's probably, from what I've heard from people, even more scary here than it is in some other parts of the country, because if your skin's not white, you stand out a lot more.
Right.
So all of those things together, we are really hoping and looking to make sure that we are protecting the data of the folks who are applying. But Vermont does not have the best track record with this. So we know that when we did this really fabulous progressive piece of legislation with the driver ID cards,
Right.
When was that? Like 4 years ago? 6 years ago? Time
Oh,
was hard before the COVID, and now it's, anyway,
yeah.
which was a great thing. It was sort of making sure that folks who are undocumented can get driver's licenses. Really exciting. And I think we were really proud of that and doing that work. But it turns out that it was essentially like, there was two things that happened. One, we essentially created a registry of undocumented immigrants that was sent off to ICE a few times by just like random people working at the DMV who felt like they should take it into their own hands. And somehow that data wasn't well protected enough that they weren't able to do that, that they were able to do that. And then the second thing that happened is because we connected that information to another piece of information, which is voting registration. We had a bunch of migrant workers, undocumented folks who, and not all undocumented folks are migrant workers. I don't want to equate those two.
Right.
Right. But we had a lot of undocumented folks who were registered to vote, who didn't want to be registered to vote, who knew that they weren't eligible to vote, but because it was an automatic DMV process, fraud was basically committed for them. And that had really significant blowback. And as both of those things have now been fixed, but I really understand anyone having any hesitancy to step up and say, yes, I deserve this money. I'm a Vermonter. I've been paying taxes in sort of the environment that we're operating on and in. And so I'm really hoping that the deep collaborations with Migrant Justice, which is a trusted organization, can help folks feel like they have a right to this money that is theirs as Vermonters.
Is it possible to, and I say this not knowing some of the strings that are attached to this federal funding. Is it possible to give a lump sum to some of these organizations and have them disseminate, or?
I'm not sure. I
Okay.
know that was part of the debate at one point, and it wasn't clear to us if that was going to be work within the CARES Act restrictions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm looking forward to finding out more about that as we move towards implementation.
Okay.
I know that's something that New York State has tried a little bit to sort of issue larger checks to immigration lawyers and then have immigration lawyers sort of dispense cash as they see fit. I'm not sure Vermont has the infrastructure for like the community-based infrastructure for that in the same way.
Mm. It's so complicated because we're trying to provide some sort of equity,
Mm-hmm.
but on a large scale, one of I'm going to use best for the lack of a better term. One of the best ways to provide equity is to make sure everything is transparent and everything is pretty well, like, people have good guidance and things are structured really well. But we're dealing with a system that is not transparent, that is not structured well, that is
Mm-hmm.
already broken. I guess this is my long way of saying, boy, I'm glad I'm not the one who has to figure that out.
Well, it's, I mean, there's like the existential question that I wrestle with every day, which is how do you create justice within a deeply unjust system?
Mm-hmm.
And I know that that's a question that's caused many people to say you can't and, be on the outside of the system. And I'm still holding on to shreds of hope that it's possible and fighting for that every day, along with some great colleagues. But it's also, more specifically in the context of this COVID relief funds, and we've talked about this a little bit before,
Mm-hmm.
even when we're debating these issues in the House, in committee, we're hyper aware that if we're trying to create, we're not all hyper aware. Some of us are hyper aware that if we're trying to create a workaround, that's not the kind of thing that you want to say like on the record to your legislative counsel, because
Mm-hmm.
that's proof to the feds that you're creating a workaround instead of, going in with best intentions. And so that's a funny piece of all this. I'm going to mute because things just got really loud. So maybe you can say something.
I will try to say something intelligent while the work is going on. Well, actually, I do. I want to kind of tease out what you were just saying about working with inside the system or outside the system when the system is broken. I think there is value to standing outside the system and throwing stones. I mean, to a certain extent, that is a little bit how journalism has been set up, that we are supposed to be kind of back at the back row witnessing history and then pointing out where things are working or not working and those type of things. So journalists are a little bit supposed to be on the outside throwing stones. And so there is a place for that. But to be honest, I'm not sure you can truly, you need both. You need people inside the system too. Because one of the dangers about tearing down an existing system, I feel, is unless you're really clear about what's going to replace it, you risk creating a vacuum. And in that vacuum, those with very nefarious intentions can hijack things. And so I think it's such a balancing act, but I think you need both. So it's not even about holding on to shreds of hope that you can make change within the system. If you want to make change, someone's got to be inside the system because someone has to unlock the door from the inside.
I agree. And
Oh, good. I was hoping
about,
that the noise had stopped in the background, that you could jump in there.
when I think about journalism today, especially sort of outside of Vermont journalism,
Mm-hmm.
Throwing stones from the outside, as the glass houses metaphor is pretty, feels very apt in that, like, we have some deeply capitalist media operating right now in America, right?
Yep.
And so our ability to throw stones effectively when we are for-profit entities against a system that really seems to, I don't think is even broken. I think, you know, in a lot of ways it was set up to marginalize people for profits, is really complicated. And so that's why that's where I wonder sometimes about sort of the ability to find justice, or like a better balanced, kinder capitalism, or the ability to have a true democracy when people don't have the time to debate, or the education that has supported them in developing those skills, or any of those things. So, but I agree, someone has to, if nothing else, alleviate the suffering on the way.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so for me, when I think about alleviating the suffering on the way, and shaping a new system, you know, this pandemic is a portal, all of the hope that I think we talked about so much at the beginning of the pandemic for what could be on the other side. When I see the attention that we're paying to these, to hazard pay, to stimulus equity, to workers' rights through reforming the unemployment system or the workers' compensation system, when we look at how we might like reimagine downtown so that public spaces can be safe and healthy, when I think about how much our communities are showing up with compassion for teachers, after a really dark decade of, you know, hating on teachers, those are the things that sort of give me hope.
Change is slow. Transformation. No, actually, I'm going to change. I'm going to change what I was just about to say about change. Change can happen in an instant. It's transformation that takes longer. You know, because change is simple. I mean, Trump's election was change.
Yeah.
You know, but transformation takes more time.
Absolutely.
And it's tough to be patient through that time.
And, you know, it was after a lifetime of being taught a history of great men and grand events and turning points. I've been trying, in order to have sort of the resiliency to be in these moments together, really trying to reteach myself a vision of history and living through history that is about individual people and movements and relationships, and sort of a slow churn towards something that Trump would not have been elected. That moment wouldn't have happened if not for, you know, millions of smaller moments leading up to that, and the transformation that's happening because of that one moment is shaped by each person participating in it. And so, you know, remembering that even these like small conversations that we might have about the, you know, tourism industry and what it means for the resiliency of our state and the quality of life of the people living within it, those might be like really, you know, seeded 2 years ago, brought to the fore because of the pandemic, and then really available to us to think about transformation on the other side because of that. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I agree. And I think what you're saying keeps bringing me back to one of the things that's so fascinating about this pandemic, and I hope it doesn't trip up the process of transformation that we might have in the big picture, is once again, we've got these quick emergencies we have to respond to. And in some cases, not always, but in some cases, you know, sometimes with it's an emergency, the ends just have to justify the means. But we have to be so careful if we have these bigger picture, long-term things we want to put in place. How do we also use this time to make sure those big picture, long-term things keep moving forward and this opportunity gets used well? I see it in this hazard pay discussion we're having, but I also see it in, and I know we haven't brought this up yet, but I see it a little bit in the global Solutions Act, if I have that name
Global
right.
Warming Solutions Act.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Because that is actually looking, whether you agree with it or not, I feel it's actually taking some of what's happening now and looking a little bit long term. And so I'm glad to see that, because while we have the immediate things of how do we make sure people can pay their bills when the economy's been pulled out from under them, and this Solutions Act is a little bit like, okay, what's next? Where's the long-term resiliency in this?
Yeah, and listeners, we had an entire episode about the Global Warming Solutions Act. Our guest was Tim Briglin, right? Yes?
Yes.
Yep. Yes? Okay. And that was a bunch of months ago. And so folks can find that if they'd like.
Would have been mid-January.
Okay. I think it was in the real life.
Yep.
I mean, you and I weren't in the real life together, but I think Tim and I were in the real life together.
Anyway. Yeah, you were actually in the State House having the conversation, and I was here in Demerston.
Great. Yeah. So anyway, if folks want to go find that, we got deep into the details.
Yeah.
But we just passed the Senate amendments yesterday. I think that was yesterday.
Sounds Wednesday?
Maybe it was Wednesday. Yep. Great. All the days. So this week we passed that.
Why at the end of it?
Veto-proof majority in the House, veto-proof majority in the Senate. The governor is imagined to veto it, but might not do that with the strong votes that we have. But one thing that happened in the debate this week, and it was actually Laura Sibilia who said this, Rep. Laura Sibilia from Dover. She spoke to exactly what you're saying, Olga, that, there was some conversation on the floor about, like, in these times, can we really afford to be thinking about climate change when they're in the middle of a pandemic? And she said, if we could have foreseen this pandemic, shouldn't we have done everything we could have to prevent it and to prevent the deaths? And, that's certainly a conversation happening at the national level, because it seems that we did foresee the pandemic and we could have done things to prevent it and we didn't. But, which is, a little too dark for me right now. I don't want to be blithe about it, but it's a conversation for another
day. It's a frustrating, painful conversation. Yeah.
And so that's exactly what we have the chance to do with the Global Warming Solutions Act, to know that things are getting worse. And we need to put in place a real strategic plan to do something about it and hold ourselves accountable to it, because it's so hard to keep your eye on the prize. And so for me to have like really strong strategic planning and accountability mechanisms built into legislation that is like also a cause I care very deeply about is just like the trifecta of good work.
I have to admit, I have been feeling, or some of the legislation I've been seeing in a way is getting smarter. In that it is acknowledging that you can't just pull one lever at a time if you want to make broad change. You need to pull a bunch of different, it's, when you're looking at impacts, it's more of a Venn diagram rather than just these individual little silos. And that gives me hope for future legislation.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
So I'm looking at the clock.
And is it toasting time?
We are toasting time, definitely. Okay. So I can't wait to hear your toast.
I'm going to pour water from my magical never leave my desk carafe.
How does it get more water in it then?
Every morning I fill it.
Okay.
Before I sit down, I clean all the refuse off from the day before and I fill the carafe with water.
That is a good routine.
But
we digress.
Yeah, anyway, the toast. Yeah. So Labor Day was on Monday.
Yes.
And schools opened all across the state on Tuesday. And for me, that is such a powerful juxtaposition. We know that it was very hard for parents to send their kids off And most parents felt like they absolutely had to if they were going to continue making a living and having everyone come out the other side of that. And I know that a lot of teachers care and school staff care so deeply about the youth that they work with, and we're sort of terrified to go out into the work world in this really high infection environment. And so sort of that combination of like the value of labor and how our schools fit into that, and people feeling like, I think so many people felt so trapped in their choices on those 2 days. And yet like somehow we are still resilient through it, and we're like still showing up and loving each other through that. And so that is what I want to toast to, is our resilience in the face of late stage capitalism.
You're here.
To the teachers and the parents and the kids.
To the teachers and the parents, and the willingness to wrestle with tough choices, even when they are hard.
Yeah. Oh, and the school bus drivers. Like,
oh,
triple cheers to the school bus drivers.
Goodness, yes. Even in non-pandemic times, bus drivers need triple cheers.
Yeah.
Well, Emilie, thank you for the great conversation today. And if people want to find more information, or if they have questions for you, where can they find that info?
EmilieKornheiser.org or ekornheiser@gmail.com or ekornheiser@ledge.state.vt.us, or any of the Facebook, Twitter, Instagram choices that you would like. I do, I'm hosting community conversations every Saturday at 10 a.m.
Will you be doing it this Saturday though? Because it's representative.
I think I'm gonna do a little double Zoom action.
I'm tuning into that.
Don't tell anyone. So anyway, every Saturday at 10 a.m., mostly because I didn't realize that town meeting was at the same time and time to cancel. So anyway, every Saturday, 10 a.m., join me for a community conversation via Zoom. You can find the link at any of the previous platforms I mentioned. Would love to talk to you.
And this is the Montpelier Happy Hour on WBEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro. We air 2 p.m. every Friday, or you can always find us on the Vermontitude SoundCloud page, the Vermontitude Facebook page, and YouTube and BCTV. Have a great weekend, everybody. Take care.